So first up is Don Christie of Catalyst IT, who we've already had some talks from. He's going to enlighten us on how the history and international examples can teach us about doing better for less. Now, I've also been researching a lot of our speakers and have some weird fun facts about them as well. So did you know that Don once built a fully functional computer out of Lego bricks? He can talk to you about that afterwards at the drinks. So, and did you also know that salivate is the only word that makes you do what it means? So there's one to leave you with, and we'll hand over to Don.
I thought it was procrastinate, which is what I do when I've got a talk to give. Tēnā koutou. Ko Katarina oku tipuna I whanau ko I Zambia. Ko Mawingo te waka, ko Kiamgon te maunga, ko Zambezi te awa. Enare ko te whanganui a tara tōku tino kainga, ko Don Christie, aho, muliwanji. My family whakapapa's back to the northeast of Scotland. I was born and brought up in a lovely country called Zambia, but my heart is here in Te Whanganui Atara, where I've lived for over 30 years, having arrived on a little boat called Mawingo, which means little cloud in Swahili. So today, I'm going to talk to you about a trip I've just embarked in. Did you know that according to our Government Chief Digital Officer, Paul James, the New Zealand government spends $12 billion a year on IT solutions. Most of that money will be provided by spent on overseas companies, and most of it on commercial software. The evidence from the last 6 years is that our spending on subscriptions and other sort of cloud technologies have increased by about 70%, which is interesting. But research in Europe over many years has shown that maybe we're spending about 3.5 times more than we should be on those sort of solutions. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. It feels to me like we're at a point of change in Wellington, in our city, and a point of change in New Zealand, and a time where we in this tech community, in this amazing city, should be taking that challenge and really, really thinking hard about how we approach the future and how we approach the challenges of delivering a lot more for a lot less with a lot more trust. And that's a core theme of this conference. So I was lucky. I got to travel to Germany, France, UK, and Ireland for 3 weeks. I got to meet partners and clients who are using Kiwi-made open source software. And I got to learn a little bit about what's happening in Europe in the IT space, particularly in government and the tertiary sectors. And particularly how over a period of many years, the EU countries have been breaking away from the constraints and shackles of very narrow and rigid, homogeneous commercial software. One of the most interesting projects we've been involved in, is not a big one for Catalyst, is a project called Samba AD. So this is an open source project that reverse engineers the Microsoft AD protocols. The Ministry of Finance in France is the largest ministry in France. It has over 200,000 users who all have Microsoft machines. And they use Samba AD for their directory and identity management services. They do that because it gives them choice. They do that because it means, for example, they can choose the databases, the office suites, the web browsers, the cloud providers that they want to choose for the right reasons, rather than because one provider has forced them through the identity management layer into a particular cloud. And by doing that, they don't only create choices for themselves, they create opportunity for innovation and including point solutions that are better for the task in hand. The project that we've just finished, once the the security and new features have been rolled out to the French ministries and agencies will allow those ministries to get a 5 out of 5 ANSI cybersecurity rating, which no French ministry has ever had before. And all that work's been done by a small company in Wellington. So Wellingtonians, you should congratulate yourself for that. Now, France's adoption of open source software is strategic. It comes from the top down, the president, Macron, and it comes from the bottom up and has been there for many years. So, for example, in the government sector, there's a very strong push and support for open source software running on your Windows devices. So, they support LibreOffice as your Office suite. They want you to install Firefox. They have a whole suite of software like Nextcloud and Postgres and email engines and so on that can run very nicely on your Windows machines. And they're quite deliberate about supporting that. And organizations like the Gendarmerie are very famous for ensuring that not only is the software that's running on their devices, the applications, free software, but the operating system, Linux operating systems as well. I think they use Ubuntu. One interesting figure from France is that when Windows 11 rolls out, it will force obsolescence on hardware, so it'll stop supporting older Intel chipsets. If the ministries are able not to replace their hardware for a certain number of years until it actually becomes obsolescence, one ministry alone, the finance one, would save up to 25 million euros just from being able to do that, because they won't be forced to do that upgrade, because they're not reliant on a single stack, which is not to say, as I say, that they don't use Microsoft software, or they won't use Azure, or they won't use AWS, or they won't use local cloud like OVH Cloud. But it does mean that they have choices, and they spend their money wisely, and they leave space for innovation. This picture is taken in the famous city of Nantes, in the Principality of Brittany, and that is a sort of steampunk kind of museum on Les Machines de Ile, and that elephant is just one of the amazing creatures that they have in Nantes. I kind of had to put Ireland in just because I was able to take this photograph at the airport. And really to focus on the Irish universities, there's actually, despite what some politicians in New Zealand have said, there are lots of universities in Ireland. Most of them use open source software to deliver online learning to their students, and at least half of them are my clients. But the interesting thing about Ireland is that commitment to open source software is allowing them to design degree programs in ways that hadn't been thought of before, and allowing them the flexibility in the choice of tools to not be constrained by the platforms that they're using, but actually the constraints only by their imagination of what the program outcomes that they're looking for in their degree program should be. So that was really quite interesting to me. And just of note, I was able to skip out of Ireland about 12 hours before Microsoft took Ryanair out, and then 12 hours later I was able to skip out of the UK just after all of that was taking place. So there are lessons around hegemony there as well, I believe. I'll flick on to Switzerland, not because I went to Switzerland on this trip, unfortunately, but hopefully a lot of you in this room are aware of legislation that has just in the last few days gone into action in Switzerland. This legislation requires the Swiss government to use open source software in the way that Peter was talking about earlier, the reuse of open source software. And it requires the Swiss government to publish software that it has commissioned to write for it under an open source license. That is going to drive innovation. If nothing else, that will drive innovation and collaboration. Open source communities are global. And again, we saw that example from Peter this morning, where the Australian government was able to spend a fraction of what the UK government spent on its open platforms several years ago. And I remember visiting the UK government office that Peter led about 14 years ago. and thinking, oh, well, that's easy, we'll just adopt that in New Zealand, and getting absolutely zero interest out of New Zealand for that approach. I think we're not in that position anymore. I don't think we can afford to be, and I don't think we should want to be. This is a really bad photo I took in Frankfurt. I was lucky enough to have a meeting with the the State of Hessen Ministry of Education. Again, they use open source software. They have the population of the State of Hessen is 6.5 million. It's not too different from New Zealand's population. They manage their own cloud infrastructure for their schools. They have a Schulportal, and they have 1,300 schools on the open source learning management system, Moodle, that they manage and run themselves. And they have another 1,000 schools running Mahara, which is a New Zealand open source project, student portfolio project. Really interesting what they're doing. The interesting thing about that ministry is, yes, they're getting some cost savings from doing that, but mostly they're getting things that are part of the requirements of Germany around privacy, making sure data is held locally, it has to be held within state, and making sure they have control of their own destiny. So there's a lot of stuff that they can do with this open source software, but it really helps them deliver a really trusted platform to their learners and their teachers and the parents of the learners. And again, often in New Zealand, we go to the end point and say, oh yes, I'll have one of those things, without mapping out the journey that created that trust layer. And it's that open source, keep it local, keep it trusted journey that they've taken their society, their citizens on, not their clients, their citizens, on to build that trust. And the state of Hessen is not the only state that has that story. There are many other German states that are doing exactly the same thing with exactly the same software suites. Oops, that wasn't quite what I was going to do. Oh, okay. Slides. Europe slide. So the European Union is renowned for investing in and building open source platforms. In another environment, I've spoken about the investment that the EU is putting into federated cloud and creating open source cloud storage platforms that are federated, highly localized, but then can join together using APIs where each local data store gives permission for when data can be used and what it can be used for. Similar in a way to the idea that the Minister was talking about this morning about, when as a user do I want my data to be shared with IRD or the Ministry of Education or Health, and what data and for what period of time and so on. Putting that control into the hands of where that data should be. But the EU has also spent quite a lot of time studying the impacts of taking up open source. So they talk about the benefits of open source greatly outweighing the costs associated with it, and cost-benefit ratio of 1 to 4. A lot of people talk about Estonia. I think Peter talked about the Estonian model before. When Estonia left the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, economically it was a basket case. The population had an extraordinarily low trust in government, as you can imagine, coming out of a Soviet state. And the only way the country could see itself getting onto a modern footing was through the adoption of open source software and collaboration and transparency to create digital environments that their citizens would buy into. Now, in New Zealand, I know that our government has looked at what Estonia has done and said, oh, yes, we need to have everyone on an identity management system. Oh, yes, we need to do this, we need to do that. But they never seem to join the dots as to what it was that created that trust environment that allowed Estonian citizens to be so trusting of digital government. And not only that, stimulated a digital economy that is now a world leader. And not only that, Estonia now, from a GDP perspective, is on a par with other Nordic states like Finland. So, moving on to what we can do in the New Zealand government and what maybe has happened in the past. I've been around for a long time. I had lunch with an old friend of mine, because we're all old, and sometimes when I give talks like this, it feels a little bit like Groundhog Day, and I'm the angry old guy at the front of the room, and I do apologise for that. I need to pass the baton on. But I will tell you a story from 2010. 2010, I was summoned to the then Minister of Finance office, and I was instructed to go away and build an open source working group to advise the government on strategy for adoption of open source. This was something that was happening in the UK, Europe, and the OECD in general. So I did that. I put together the group, I put together a proposal, and very quickly the then GCIO, which was part of State Services, got wind of this initiative. And they said, no, Minister, you can't possibly do that. We have this topic under control, and we'll be coming up with our own policy soon. 14 years later, I'm still waiting for that policy. To me, the shame of this is that we have missed out on 14 years of a superpower that has allowed companies like Facebook, Amazon, and Google to explode. It's allowed Estonia to change its pathway. We've heard about India and others. And New Zealand has been blind to it. There was a question up on the Slido deck about that, I think, for Peter, that didn't get answered. I don't quite know what the answer is. But let me just outline some of the advantages that the EU has pointed out around open source software. Lower risks. You're reusing stuff that has been developed by some of the best engineers in the world and communities across the world. You're not having to reinvent the wheel. High velocity, you're able to test, you're able to run proofs of concepts. I mean, Alex and I are sharing a platform today, and Alex is the king of proof of concepts, as is X equals. Interoperability, open source software is interoperable by nature. We used to talk a lot about open standards, and I'd love that talk to come back to government because it enables innovation, it enables interoperability. It means we can do what is really, this tool is really good for, but not be expecting it to do all this other stuff just because, it got bundled into the package and it seemed like it was the thing. It wasn't the best solution. There's vendor independence. There's no dependence on any vendor if you pick an open source platform. Like in Wellington alone, we have Silverstripe, we have Hakama, we have Soma, we have X equals. We have a dozen or more open source companies who can all support different open source platforms. And we have students coming out of our tertiary education system, out of Polytechnic and university, who are all well versed in these technologies. We're here, we're waiting, we're ready to go. And security. There's a whole different talk about open source security. It's not that software is more or less secure. It's a transparency, it's a governance, it's a due diligence that you can do. It's a software bill of materials work and so on. And finally, trust. This conference is about trust. And you don't get more trust than when things are transparent and when people are brought on a journey. The one time in the last 14 years I've really seen the New Zealand government use open source to build trust was with the health COVID app. And it was critical that we got that right, given all the misinformation and interesting concerns people had, the heightened levels of anxiety we had in our society. It was so critical that that app was trustworthy. And they were very transparent about how they handled your data. They were very transparent about the code. And they were very purposeful about making it an open source application. And that worked. I don't know of many people that didn't use the Ministry of Health COVID Tracer app. So this is a big opportunity for us. The best time to plant an oak tree is 20 years ago, but this is now. Let's plant it now. Wellington's a city I love. We can't sit passively and just wait for stuff to happen to us. We can actually save billions of dollars, which means saving jobs and doing really interesting things through a very purposeful strategic adoption of open source. Of course, we'll talk about AI. There's a stack of stuff we can do with AI and open source software and be true to our desire to have, 2 minutes, good, control over our destinies and our data. You know, New Zealand's population is, 0.4% of the world? So what's our internet, what's our public knowledge presence? Around that, maybe 1% if we're lucky. So any sort of like massive AI engine is going to misrepresent New Zealand. So let's build this stuff here in New Zealand using our own capability and using our own genius. The tools are out there. We don't have to build them from scratch. And they are open source. So I'm done now. Difficult questions.
Yes,
oh my goodness.
Thanks very much, Don. Well, you said you're one of the ones that were definitely at the top of the list, so we're going to go with those. And that one's just hit the top. So are we now inextricably in the pocket of and at the mercy of Microsoft, Alphabet and Amazon? What can we do to change that?
No, of course not. And that's my point. I think if you see, one of the things when I was in the UK watching this Microsoft Central US region outage followed by the CrowdStrike outage was a commentary on the BBC. On the one hand, you had, I would say, one generation of commentators saying, this is just how it is. It's, you know, you've got to suck it up. Everything's on Amazon and Microsoft. And on the other hand, you had people that maybe had been around a bit longer saying, no, we've got to, you know, we can do heterogeneity. We have, for example, just to, you know, toot our own trumpet, we have built a cloud in New Zealand using hyperscale open source technology that came out of NASA and CERN, and we have 3 regions in New Zealand. We have GPU as a service, we have Kubernetes as a service. You can have a multi-cloud solution that combines the best of Microsoft, the best of Amazon, and the best of a local cloud provider. That's absolutely doable. And it's the open source layer, actually, it's the Kubernetes layer that allows us to transparently shift applications from one to another. The one thing I will say is that without patronage, that's all we'll end up with. And that has to be strategic, and it has to be thought through.
One last question so we can get Alex up. Oh, okay. Could it be that New Zealand politicians are simply too short-sighted, too interested in quick political wins to invest in trust building and true investment?
No, I don't think that is true. The Minister of Finance I was talking about before was very into skunk works and proof of concepts and doing things very quickly. I would say, I don't know about people in this room, but I would say the government civil service was guilty of all those things and guilty of giving ministers bad advice and only advice that took them down to one end point. The Cloud First policy is a classic example of that, but there are others. And I think in this room, we have the people that can change that advice and that should be thinking much more deeply about what advice they're giving ministers, and in particularly how to give ministers the sort of quick wins that you're talking about in citizen-centred digital services, for example, and all sorts of other things we can do very fast through the reuse of other people's software.
Cool. Thank you very much, Don, and thanks for your continued support of Govis.